The internet has experienced more than a few updates since 1996, but the same can't be said for internet regulations. 2021 is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the last comprehensive update to internet regulation. Since then, the internet's evolution has created endless possibilities and new challenges too. Facebook supports updated regulations that set clear guidelines on today's toughest challenges, including protecting people's privacy, fighting misinformation, reforming Section 230, and more. But Facebook isn't waiting for regulation. They're continuing to take action to improve and secure its platforms, building new privacy tools, tripling their security and safety teams, and working with tech peers to enable the safe and secure transfer of data between platforms. See Facebook's progress on key issues and what's next at about.fb.com/regulations.
It's the Media Buzz Meter with Howard Kurtz.
Now, this may not be the most important issue facing the world, but does John Kerry have any sense of optics? He's on a flight the other day from Boston to D.C., American Airlines plane, sitting in first class. Somebody takes a picture of him, and he's sitting there, and he doesn't keep his mask on. He's got it maybe around his neck or something. He's not eating. He's not drinking. And it just so happens that the chief operating officer of American Airlines had put out a press release saying American Airlines, and I'm sure the other airlines have done this as well, will fully comply with President Biden's mask regulations, which is when you're on public transit, and this wasn't one of those private plane flights that somebody like Kerry, who's pretty wealthy, also gets to take, you have to wear a mask. And you're doing that not just to protect yourself, but to protect other people, even in first class. This guy is the climate envoy for the Biden administration, so he's a fairly senior White House official. His own president is urging people, wear a mask, do it, be patriotic. That's why you do it. John Kerry can't go along, and then he's dumb enough to sit there and, have a picture taken so it kind of goes viral. I just think, when you have one of those jobs, there is an extra responsibility. I mean, you should do it anyway. Extra responsibility on you because you're somebody in high office who needs to set an example, especially when the president who you work for, who just recently picked you for the job, has made such a front and center issue about how we all have to protect society by wearing masks. All right. Also in the somewhat lighter category, Marvel Comics has just unveiled a new Captain America. Now, Captain America has been around for 80 years and started out, as a World War II crime fighter. That's hence the name, and then he went away for a while, and then he came back, and I guess there's been different versions. But in the new version, according to Marvel, Captain America will be gay. He is, the name of his alter ego, Aaron Fisher, the character, will be the first LGBTQ character to have the Star-Spangled Shield. He's described as Captain America of the Railways, a fearless teen who stepped up to protect fellow runaways and the unhoused, also known as homeless. Marvel Comics is proud to honor Pride Month with the rise of this new LGBTQ hero. Okay, that's great. Everybody should be represented. It's a limited series thing, so it's not going to go on forever. But I was looking at the drawings that Marvel put out, and it kind of feels pretty stereotypical to me. It is a younger guy, and he's got tattoos, and he's wearing a red bandana. He's got a mullet haircut. I don't know. I guess everybody can make up their own mind about this. But, certainly comics were a lily white field for so long. And then you had, the first black superheroes, and then you had superheroes of other ethnicities. And all that is good. And so I think it's a good idea. Maybe it'll become a movie. I mean, everything that Marvel does now seems to become a movie. People who listen to this podcast know that I was a huge, huge comic book fan. In fact, I had wrote and illustrated my own series of about 40 issues of my own characters, which once upon a time I posted a couple of those screenshots on my Twitter feed. Spider-Man was always huge. And all the characters that Marvel invented, Iron Man became, huge in the movies. Spider-Man became huge in the movies. But even these minor characters like Thor, it wasn't a big deal at the time. He gets a movie. Ant-Man was a very minor Marvel character, and he's gotten a movie. So everybody gets a movie. All right, I got some serious business to attend to here, folks. And so let's start with story number one, which is the tragedy in Atlanta. And I want to talk about discrimination as well as violence against Asian Americans. I mean, you know by now that a guy with a gun, I don't mention the names of these mass killers because that's what they want. They crave attention. Went into 3 separate massage parlors filled with Asian Americans, killed 8 people, 6 of them of Asian descent. 6 of those women were of Asian descent. And it's a horrible, horrible hate crime. And by the way, any police official who gets up there, I understand, hate crime is a very specific legal designation. So you can't just come and spout off because it seems that way. And sometimes that has seemed to be wrong. Going back to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, I remember rushed to judgment by some people saying, well, this clearly was Muslim terrorism, and it turned out to be Timothy McVeigh, a homegrown American terrorist. But for any police chief to say, well, I don't really see a motive here, and the guy was having a bad day, I mean, that is just almost criminal to say those things. Just heartbreaking. And it obviously has given rise to all kinds of raw feelings in the Asian American community. And by the way, there's a lot of finger pointing here. And I'm so sick of getting into this blame game thing, because even in the Oklahoma City bombing, some decades ago, President Clinton gave a speech in which he said the climate for somebody like Timothy McVeigh to kill all those federal employees by blowing up that building in Oklahoma was fostered by people like Rush Limbaugh. Well, Rush Limbaugh had nothing to do with the Oklahoma City bombing, and you can object to some of the rhetoric that Rush might have used. And every time since then, whether it's the shooter who killed a bunch of people in Arizona and wounded for life, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, and on and on and on. Every time there's a terrorist attack, every time there's one of these things, people look for political advantage on both sides. I'll get into that in a moment. But it just seems to me that when you do look at what has been an increasing number of hate crimes and violent attacks and other attacks involving the Asian American community, it just doesn't get the coverage that any attack on a synagogue gets when there's a swastika, that any attack on a black person gets, particularly if it's a white police officer shooting type situation, a la George Floyd, a la so many of the ones that we went through in the past year, the tragic, it gave rise to a whole movement against racial injustice. Or Muslims being scapegoated because there are Muslims who are terrorists who come from other countries, most famously on 9/11, but at other instances as well. And then there's just a backlash and discrimination against Muslims. And I remember George W. Bush, when he was president, in the wake of September 11th, 2001, talking about Muslims and mosques and freedom of worship and all of that. And that was very much to his credit. So the way the New York Times puts it is, this has given rise to a tortured public conversation over how to confront a rise in reports of violence against Asian Americans who have felt increasingly vulnerable with each new attack. Many incidents, says the paper, have either not led to arrests or not been charged as hate crimes, making it difficult to capture with data the extent to which Asian Americans are being targeted. I mean, I've read advocates say 3,400 or maybe it was 3,800 incidents over the past year, but that's not a definitive figure. And so using this horrible violence, the senseless loss of lives in these shootings in Atlanta, the debate unfolds as to what legally qualifies as anti-Asian bias. And the Asian American community is grappling with the reality that the law is simply not designed to account for many ways in which Asian Americans experience racism. That could be discrimination, it could be slurs, or it could be something much, much worse. For example, as the Times points out, there's no widely recognized symbol of anti-Asian hatred compared to a noose or a swastika. Historically, many Asian crime victims around the country were small business owners who were robbed. And now, were they robbed because somebody was trying to get some money, or was there something more to it? A law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Lu In Wang, says there's a recognizable prototype with anti-black or anti-Semitic or anti-hate. Let me do that again. A law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Lu In Wang, says there's a recognizable prototype with anti-black or anti-Semitic or anti-gay hate crime. They're all more often more clear-cut. Now, President Biden spoke out yesterday, while not prejudging the law enforcement investigation in Atlanta, says, I know Asian Americans are very concerned because, as you know, I've been speaking about the brutality against Asian Americans for the last couple of months. I think it is very, very troublesome. And I just got word that the president will go to Atlanta tomorrow to meet with community leaders and show his concern in the wake of these murders. And then you had Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, in a briefing yesterday saying, I think there's no question that some of the damaging rhetoric we saw during the prior administration, blaming, calling COVID, the Wuhan virus or other things, led to perceptions of the Asian American community that are inaccurate, unfair, has elevated threats against Asian Americans. So that's blaming Donald Trump. Now, am I a fan of the former president of the United States talking about the China virus and the Wuhan virus? And he did this again when he called into Maria Bartiromo the other night. Or talking about Kung Flu, which is not a very funny play on words. I am not. But is it fair to say that when President Trump did that, it whipped up violence against Asian Americans? That this crazy, I'm going to refrain from using an obscenity here, that this crazy person filled with hate who went to these Asian massage parlors was influenced by Donald Trump? We don't even know if he is involved in politics at all. And so I resisted this. When law enforcement officers would be killed, and some people would blame President Obama. They would say, because Obama took this, that, or the other stance against the police or asking for police reform, it's his fault. And that the whole blood on the hands argument. I think it was unfair in Obama's case. I think it was unfair to Sarah Palin, which she was blamed for the attack I mentioned earlier, because she had a map with a bunch of districts with crosshairs painted on Democratic districts. And I think it's unfair to Donald Trump. Now, that's not letting Trump off the hook. People want to criticize his rhetoric. That's fine. I think that a lot of people have interpreted the fact that, and again, I'm not a fan of the way China handled the virus and lied about it and covered up and was slow to react to what became this horrible global pandemic. I'm not defending that in any way, shape, or form. But how is the vast majority of Asian people, Asian American people, people of Asian descent in any country, how are they to blame for what the Beijing government did when this virus first surfaced well over a year ago? And, I'm reminded, I did a little research on this. It was back last September, the House passed a resolution sponsored by a Democratic Asian American Congresswoman, Grace Meng of New York. And it's symbolic. It's a resolution to condemn anti-Asian bigotry and hate crimes. Every Democrat in the House voted for it. 14 Republicans voted for it. And every other Republican member voted against it. So you ask again, how did this become a partisan issue? Well, the aforementioned Steve Scalise said, well, it was a waste of time because it didn't really do anything. I think the Republicans were playing defense because they saw it as a shot at Trump's rhetoric. And Grace Meng was quoted yesterday in the Washington Post and said, I put forth that resolution last year not for any partisan purpose or attacking anyone. I wanted to show the Asian community that Congress, your leaders on both sides of the aisle, condemn this sort of bigotry. I never expected it to be partisan at all. And yet, like everything else in American life, it has become partisan. And by the way, even now, in the wake of the Atlanta attacks, top House and Senate Republican leaders did not release any statement or even any tweet about the killings yesterday. Democrats did. They were talking about other issues. I get it. The only two Republican Asian American members of Congress, Michelle Steele and Young Kim of California, did express their concerns about the rising number of attacks against the community. And by the way, a CNN reporter who's Korean American, Amara Walker, was doing a live shot with Don Lemon, and as she was getting ready to talk to him, somebody drove by and shouted virus at her. And that encapsulates how ugly this has gotten. All right, let's move on now to number two. I talked a lot yesterday about President Biden's interview with George Stephanopoulos and how he made news on all these different subjects, including Andrew Cuomo, including the border, including Afghanistan, including the filibuster. But the one thing he said that wasn't a soundbite at all has actually made a whole lot of news in Russia. Russia, in fact, has recalled its ambassador to the United States and unleashed just huge rhetorical attacks aimed at Biden. So Stephanopoulos says to the president, do you think Putin is a killer? And Biden says, I do. That's what he said. Well, the Russians have gone crazy over this. The spokeswoman for the foreign ministry said in a statement, we are interested in preventing an irreversible deterioration in relations. If the Americans become aware of the risks associated with this, Dmitry Peskov, who is the spokesman for Putin, described Biden's comments as very bad. He clearly does not want to improve relations with our country, and we will be proceeding based on this. And there's some hint that here's another official in the Russian parliament, Konstantin Kosachev. He says this is a watershed moment. Any expectations for the new U.S. administration's policy toward Russia have been written off by this boorish statement unless there are explanations and apologies. Now, look, you can understand in terms of domestic politics, the President of the United States says that the President of Russia is a killer, that would spark a huge domestic reaction. Unfortunately, it happens to be true. And just the latest example, of course, and I think that's why this came up. Well, I mean, I guess Stephanopoulos was asking about Russian interference in the 2020 election, as confirmed by the declassified intel report that I talked about yesterday. But it is not an accident. Nothing happens in Russia without Putin's approval in terms of the Russian government. So Alexei Navalny, there was this attempt to kill him by poisoning. And Putin made a joke and said, well, if Russian agents had wanted to kill him, they probably would have finished the job. And so then he comes back. What do? They arrest him and send him to jail after the poisoning attempt failed. And there have been other attacks on Russians abroad, including former spy Sergei Skripal, that took place in England in 2018. And I could go on and on. In fact, I didn't realize this. In 2006, Putin signed a law legalizing targeted killings abroad. The legislation said this was inspired by his American and Israeli conduct, but it's even legal in Russia to do this, I guess, if you think you have the justification. So this is always the thing that President Trump wouldn't do, whether it was the incursion into Ukraine, whether it was interference in the 2016 election, amply documented by our own U.S. intelligence community, which Donald Trump, was criticized for sort of taking Putin's word over the word of our own intelligence officials. He would never come out and criticize Putin in this way. He might criticize something Russia had done, but he never criticized Vladimir Putin. Of course, the Helsinki summit, he drew so much attention for that for the very reasons that I'm talking about. Well, now Biden has done that. He didn't come out. Biden knew what he was doing. He didn't want to provide an inflammatory bite that could be replayed again and again and again. Yes, I think Putin's conduct has been unconscionable because, as Biden says and has said, we have to do business with Russia in areas where our mutual interests coincide. But just saying was enough to make Moscow go crazy. Don't go anywhere. More BuzzMeter coming your way in just a moment.
2021 is the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the last comprehensive update to Internet regulation. It's time for an update. That's why Facebook supports updated regulations on today's key issues. Learn more at about.fb.com/regulations.
Speaking of Trump, number 3, there's going to be a barrage of Trump books, according to Politico. And Donald Trump, at least for now, is scheduled to sit for at least a dozen interviews in the coming weeks with authors who are doing these books on his presidency. There were a huge number of books on Trump during his presidency, including one by me called Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth. Still has a lot of good stuff in it if you are interested. But for most of those books, Trump did not cooperate, except with people who were, conservative authors who clearly were going to be very kind to him. And then famously, he did cooperate with 18 tape-recorded interviews with Bob Woodward, and he was, of course, the president was very unhappy with how that book came out. Woodward and a colleague at the Post are writing a book now about the end of the Trump presidency and the beginning of the Biden presidency. I don't see him on the list here, but according to Politico, Trump is scheduled to sit down with Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, who knows him better than any other reporter who covered the White House because she covered him in New York. as well as Jeremy Peters of the New York Times, Michael Bender of the Wall Street Journal, ABC's John Carl, Michael Wolff, who wrote Fire and Fury, and then another book on the Trump presidency, and Phil Rucker and Carol Leonnig of the Washington Post. A lot of these are sequels. You know, you write a Trump book, it sells well. Why wouldn't you want to write another one? Some of his aides are concerned, according to Politico, that if Trump sits for all these interviews, he is limiting his ability to write his own or collaborate with a ghostwriter on his own memoir, which obviously would sell a lot of copies, given the fact that he got 75 million votes in the 2020 election. Omarosa, who was a White House official, quit, had a falling out, accused Trump of being a racist. Is quoted by Politico saying, Donald doesn't believe in the concept of no comment. He feels like there will always be one side of the audience who sympathizes with him. So it's not surprising to me that every one of these book interviews he's going to sit through and think he has the power to manipulate the authors and try to influence them, says Omarosa. All right. Meanwhile, the Washington Post has a piece saying that Donald Trump is under a lot of investigations. District Attorney in Manhattan is sifting through his tax records, which have now been turned over. The State Attorney General in New York has subpoenaed his lawyers, his bankers, his chief financial officer, even one of his sons. And that's just New York, the Post says. Former President Trump also facing criminal investigations in Georgia and D.C. related to his efforts to overturn the 2020 elections. I don't know what the chances are that would lead to any kind of case. And Trump must defend himself in at least 29 pending lawsuits, some seeking damages from Trump's actions before the Capitol riot on January 6th. That seems like a stretch, but obviously people have the right to sue. Now that he's lost the immunity he enjoyed as president, not to mention the legal firepower of the Justice Department, this piece points out that Donald Trump has fallen to a point of historic vulnerability before the law. I mean, prosecutors don't have to grapple with this question of whether they can bring charges against him, whether they can subpoena him. New lawsuits keep arriving. Prosecutors keep making new requests. Trump has had to hire a bunch of lawyers. Some of those lawyers have quit. And meanwhile, he's under a lot of financial pressure in his own empire. For example, just one example cited in this piece, at Trump Tower in Manhattan, one major commercial tenant, Tiffany & Company, is planning to vacate. Another, Mark Fisher Footwear, stopped paying rent in November, according to a lawsuit the Trump organization filed to get $1.4 million in back payments. If you've ever been to the Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, or have been many, many times, the Tiffany store is, a major glittering presence there. And so just the fact that, and some of this has to do with obviously political feelings against the former president, it's hurt him being president. So one estimate's saying it cost him $700 million. In other words, that his net worth went down, or the worth of his organization went down. Look, I mean, when you run for president, you serve as president, and you happen to be an internationally famous businessman, part of the price you pay. All right, let's move on to story number 4. Albany Times-Union has an interesting piece today having to do with Andrew Cuomo. As you know, and we've talked about at length, the state attorney general, and Cuomo is said to be cooperating with this, is conducting this investigation. And in fact, even those like President Biden who were saying, well, he might end up having to resign, Nancy Pelosi in the same camp. There was a headline on MSNBC yesterday that said Pelosi calls for Cuomo to step down. I repeated that on the podcast. The headline overstated what she said in the interview. She was saying, well, he should search his soul, and maybe he should, but she didn't actually call for him to resign. She said if the investigation shows the allegations to be true, then he should resign, and that's a very different matter. But in any event, now a senior aide to the governor is telling the Albany paper, we have our own inquiries going. We have an obligation to investigate any claim of sexual harassment. And we, after reporting the allegations by this unnamed female aide who still works for Cuomo to the attorney general, were directed to continue our own inquiry. So there are multiple inquiries. So the reporter then goes to the attorney general, Letitia James's office, and they didn't get an answer, but a source in the office with knowledge of the matter denied that anyone from the AG's office directed the governor's office to conduct its own investigation. It's absurd. Why would you be doing that? Said the attorney for the woman who's accused Cuomo of groping her. This is the woman who the story was broken by the Albany Times-Union. She still works there. She claims that the governor, and governor specifically denies this, put his hands under her blouse. And she obviously doesn't want to go public. The attorney for this woman says this is a shadow investigation. Obviously, if you're the governor of the state of New York and you're under investigation by what's supposed to be a fully independent state AG probe, you can't be mucking up the waters by conducting your own probe with people who are loyal to you politically. I don't know how far this has gotten, but I'd be surprised if it continues. And finally, story number 5, and that is the whole friggin' mess involving Sharon Osbourne, who is a co-host of The Talk, the CBS show. And this gets kind of convoluted, but it's getting a lot of attention, so I'll try to kind of piece my way through it. So Sharon Osbourne, wife of Ozzy, who's probably become bigger than Ozzy, maybe not Ozzy when he was at the height of his rock star fame, but certainly these days, she's been a television presence for a long time. She's been on this CBS show for 11 years. Well, right now, CBS has put the show on hiatus for a number of days while it investigates allegations involving Sharon Osbourne. And this all got triggered when they were talking about Meghan Markle and Piers Morgan going after Meghan Markle and Piers Morgan losing his job at the British morning show. And Sharon Osbourne went off and defended Piers, and some of her comments, her critics say, sounded like she was a little bit racist. She is absolutely furious, and she's talking about this publicly because she felt she was set up by her co-host. They all had this sort of agreement among themselves. They would not blindside each other, and yet, in collaboration with the producers, this is according to Sharon Osbourne, they all kind of jumped at her. How can you defend Piers Morgan? And she kind of lost it on the air and had a bit of a meltdown. She's kind of apologized for that, sort of. But now, New York Post page 6 is reporting that another co-host, Elaine Welteroth, has filed a complaint to HR at CBS about the racial insensitivity on the set after that heated exchange. And the people who run the show have invited anyone who works there to come forth with evidence. Meanwhile, there are allegations that came from the former co-host Leah Remini. She has told journalists that Sharon Osbourne, over the years, predating this whole mess with Piers and Meghan and all that, said a bunch of racist things to another former host, Julie Chen, who is Chinese American. Julie Chen also happened to be the wife of Les Moonves, who was, of course, the chairman and grand poobah of CBS. And then when he got canned over various harassment allegations, she eventually ended up leaving The Talk as well. Now, I have no idea whether this is true, but according to, I know there's a lot of names here, but according to one former co-host, Sharon Osbourne is accused of having referred to the Chinese-American, very talented TV person Julie Chen as a wonton and slanty eyes, and also having made disgusting references that I won't even repeat here to former co-host and executive producer Sarah Gilbert, who is lesbian, having to do with their anti-lesbian slurs. Trust me on this. So Sharon Osbourne goes off to the Daily Mail and says these claims are all crap. They're crap. All crap, she says. She's 68 years old. She says, everyone's got an opinion or a story like the wonton story. It's like F off of your effing wonton story. F off. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got a voice. It's fine. It's also about knowing somebody's been called out for something and then somebody else is like, yes, I'm going to add something too. Of course it's a pile-on. These are all quotes from Sharon Osbourne. So all of this has left Sharon Osbourne's friendship with other people at the show in doubt. It's left her role at the show in doubt. I could certainly see CBS coming back and saying, thanks very much for your service, but we don't need you to come in anymore. She also said in this Daily Mail interview, it's been a really, really bad week, a lot of mental pressure and heartache. She is not one to mince words. And then it goes into all the stuff about how she feels like she was set up by the show. CBS says in a statement, and the network is committed to a diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace across all of our productions. We're also very mindful of the important concerns expressed and discussions taking place regarding events on The Talk. This includes a process where all voices are heard, claims are investigated, and appropriate action is taken where necessary. So watch that space. This is an S show, since we're slinging expletives around. And I don't know what's going to happen, but whatever turns out here, a lot of people are going to be unhappy. It's just kind of blowing up the show. And It's too bad because a lot of people like that show. And in the process of defending Piers Morgan, I went back and looked at the tape. I don't know. If you don't like Sharon Osbourne, you say she's crazy and has said things that could be interpreted as racism. If you do like Sharon Osbourne, you say that she's being completely railroaded and by people who don't like her. When you get into one of these, he said, she said, she said, she said, it's really hard to know where the truth lies. But I don't think Sharon's helping herself by giving all these effing interviews and telling people to F off. But that's Sharon Osbourne. And on that note, we try to cover it all here, folks. I hope you have a great day. Stay safe. If you happen to want to subscribe to a podcast that tries to cover the media and political world from a very broad perspective, you can go to Google Podcasts, you can go to Amazon Music, Spotify, on your Amazon device, Apple iTunes. End of unpaid political plug. See you all tomorrow with more BuzzMeter.
Listen to be part of the conversation with me, Brian Kilmeade. I'll talk about the biggest stories of the day and get your take along with some of the biggest newsmakers around. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the podcast at briankilmeadshow.com.